A masked robbery crew audaciously plotted to steal a federal government money transport helicopter. What was even more unexpected was that they not only failed, but also murdered a federal agent right at the scene. This time they poked a hornet's nest, but the crisis is far from over. An internal leak led to a manhunt by the Russian mafia. With the fierce wolf ahead and the roaring tiger behind, what will they do to turn danger into safety? How can they find a glimmer of hope for survival in the face of imminent death? Let's rewind to 11 days ago. The Texas State Police Department was frantically holding a meeting. It turned out that around 8 o'clock last night, they received a call reporting an incident nearby with someone killed instantly at the location. The police immediately locked onto their targets, the two main figures, Screamin' and Richie. They are a pair of black brothers adopted years ago by a kind-hearted woman. These two men are far from simple. The older brother, Screamin', is outwardly an engineer, but is actually the leader of an underground crime ring. He has many subordinates under his command. The younger brother, Richie, served 7 years in the military. He is a sniper with a target hit rate that has never fallen below 93%. He usually works for a liquid nitrogen company, but police investigation revealed he has participated in multiple assassinations. They also have 3 accomplices, Lady Screamin's ex-girlfriend, along with Piers and Cy, 2 of Richie's friends from his military service. Analyzing the available data, Police Chief Kip realized the 2 brothers were extremely cautious and intelligent. They are connected to 10 robberies and murders, yet have never been convicted. The reason is their unpredictable behavior, and they never appear together at the same location at the same time. They haven't even had lunch together. The only time the 2 can be seen in the same frame outside of a crime scene is when they visit their adoptive mother, Susan. She is a community nurse whose benevolence led her to adopt many orphans. All these children have been involved in crime and shootings, but with the exception of a young man named Dean, who was previously sentenced to 15 years for second-degree murder. All the others successfully evaded conviction. Upon hearing this, Chief Kip felt this woman was highly significant and might be the key to cracking the case. However, Dean was currently granted a 21-day parole due to good behavior in prison. But the warden also warned him that if he committed any offense during this time, the approval would be revoked instantly. On the day Dean was released, Screamin' and Richie, a rare sight together, came to pick him up and take him home. And their adoptive mother, Susan, upon seeing Dean, was immediately moved running to hug him. The family shared a rare reunion meal. Dean cherished this hard-won moment even more. He devoutly offered a prayer before starting to enjoy the food. A warm and happy atmosphere filled the dinner table. At this moment, Susan suddenly looked towards Screamin', expressing hope that he could arrange a job for Dean at the construction site. However, Screamin' refused his adoptive mother's suggestion, stating that the position was already filled. Furthermore, he dismissed Richie's intention to help, saying that Dean had just been released from prison and it was too soon for him to surface. It would be best for him to stay home and keep Mom company, and all expenses would be covered by him and Richie. Hearing this, Dean could only agree. But Susan noticed the expressions of the 2 men, and her brows furrowed, the sense of unease in her heart growing stronger. She was about to say something, but was abruptly interrupted by Screamin', who said they had calculated everything carefully and she didn't need to worry. However, as soon as he finished speaking, he and Richie hastily stood up to say goodbye, claiming they had business to attend to. But anyone perceptive could tell the 2 were deliberately hiding something. So as soon as they stepped out the door, Dean quickly followed, hoping to join them. But Screamin's expression started to become annoyed. Just as he was about to send Dean back home to stay put, Dean suddenly dropped a bombshell. He said he had made a friend while in prison. After spending time together, he found the person very trustworthy. So he told them everything they had done. Hearing this, Screamin' and Richie immediately flew into a rage over Dean's action. Were their deeds something to be boastful about so openly? Seeing that Dean still didn't grasp the seriousness of the issue, Richie finally couldn't hold back and raised his voice in warning. If he kept being so careless, sooner or later he would implicate the other brothers. Yet Dean remained indifferent and still wanted to leave with the 2 of them. At this moment, Screamin's last bit of patience was completely exhausted. He gave Dean no chance to bargain, sternly demanding that the other return home quickly. But during the hug, a small piece of paper fell out. Taking advantage of the moment Richie hadn't noticed, Dean quickly stepped on it with his foot. After the 2 turned their backs and left, he quickly bent down to pick it up. Although Dean wanted to rejoin the crew, Screamin' and Richie were highly vigilant. While Dean was on parole, the police would certainly be keeping a quiet watch on him. For safety reasons, they absolutely could not let him be involved in the group's work anymore. Faced with the two men's uncompromising order of expulsion, Dean immediately showed a look of disappointment. But he also understood in his heart that this decision was undeniable. So, after a period of silence, he chose to accept the result and quietly drove his motorcycle away. Meanwhile, elsewhere at the Texas State Police Department, after continuous day and night investigation, they finally obtained some important clues. They discovered that the children adopted by Susan all came from the same area, and that residential area has the highest rate of contraband trafficking and crime in the entire state. However, Police Lieutenant Lisa grew even more suspicious upon hearing this Screamin' and the others all have good jobs and incomes, so why do they still involve themselves in such matters? However, Chief Kip countered, they have lived in an environment rife with criminal behavior since childhood. Certain concepts have been ingrained in their subconscious. It seems unsurprising that they would turn to a life of crime under such prolonged influence. Lisa did not pursue her opinion further. She quickly photocopied a document, then turned and left the police department. At the same time, Dean, who was abandoned by his good brothers, was not idle. He secretly went to a secluded alley and knocked on a commonplace iron gate. After entering, Dean went straight to the boss opposite, stating he had the latest plan from Screamin' and his associates, and pulled out the piece of paper he found that day. The boss across from him opened the paper, half believing, half skeptical. But when he saw the content involving a $6.6 million transaction, he finally couldn't control his expression. While they couldn't confirm if Dean genuinely held the information, such a large sum of money was still worth the risk. Therefore, that same afternoon, they investigated Screamin' and Richie's whereabouts. The gray-haired boss personally went out pretending to be a curious passerby loitering around Richie's car. This strange sight immediately put Screamin' and Richie on high alert. With their killer's intuition, both realized the old man in front of them was trouble. But in response to Richie's question, the man only said he was casually looking, then apologized, and turned to leave immediately. Although the old man didn't overtly show danger, Richie and Screamin' did not let down their guard. However, the strange thing was that even after searching their memories, they had no recollection of this person. Could the man really just be a passerby? Helplessly, the two could only temporarily part ways, as they still had respectable jobs to maintain appearances. They were unaware that Officer Cass, who was lying in wait nearby, had photographed their entire interaction. Not long after Cass excitedly brought the photos back to the police station. Upon learning that he had successfully captured the license plate, Lisa immediately requested the intelligence department to monitor and continue the investigation. As night fell, Richie drove to the rendezvous point to discuss the next plan with Screamin'. Unexpectedly, as soon as he stepped into the warehouse, he was ambushed from behind. In a daze, he saw a group of men rush out and steal all the cash he was carrying. This robbery crew was naturally the gray-haired boss's men. Seeing the two large bags overflowing with money, the gray-haired boss revealed a look of satisfaction, confirming that Dean had not lied to him. He therefore ordered his subordinate to check the scene and retreat immediately after confirming no issues. However, when the subordinate arrived at the spot where Richie had been knocked unconscious, he found that no one was on the ground. He immediately scanned the surroundings vigilantly. Unexpectedly, Richie had already grabbed him from behind. The subordinate frantically pulled out his gun, but Richie easily snatched it away, and the subordinate himself became a victim of the barrel. Although they temporarily dealt with the immediate danger, the gunshot attracted others. Fortunately, Screamin' rushed to the scene just in time, and a chaotic fight began. Despite their excellent coordination, the robbers ultimately escaped with the money. Worse still, aside from those they faced directly, the two couldn't clearly see the faces of the others. Powerless, they could only examine the subordinate's body. They found that these individuals all had the same tattoo representing the Russian mafia organization, Tamatov. Picking a fight with a group like this was absolutely not part of the brothers' plan. But the current situation left them no time for thorough deliberation. They could only hurry and retreat. Early the next morning, the police received a report and arrived at the scene to investigate. However, apart from one body, they found no other suspicious items. Fortunately, the warehouse owner finally showed up, but in response to Lisa's questions, she was completely clueless, as she had rented the warehouse to the Screamin' brothers a long time ago. Hearing this, Lisa immediately realized that the murder case last night must be connected to these two brothers. Thus, she hastily brought Cass to visit their adoptive mother, Susan. However, faced with its police's accusations, Susan firmly denied them without hesitation, saying her sons would not do such things. She added that they had been wrongfully accused many times before due to the color of their skin. She then angrily ordered them to leave. Lisa, however, was undeterred. She asked Susan to calm down, then expressed sympathy for a mother's instinct to protect her children. But this was not the right way to cover up, because Screamin' and Richie were grown men and should take responsibility for the crimes they committed. I'll give you time to think, but you know the term aid and abet, right? After Lisa and Cass left, Susan immediately called Screamin'. He was working at the construction site at the time. The noisy machinery hurt his eardrums, but Screamin' still clearly heard his adoptive mother's question. Hearing these words, Screamin' immediately froze, but before he could even open his mouth to explain, Susan hung up. At the same time, Lisa contacted Kip at the police station, asking him to investigate the background of the Russians and see if they had anything in common with the Screamin' brothers. Afterward, Lisa and Cass analyzed the existing clues and unanimously agreed that this case involved the Russians, but it wasn't necessarily meant to cause an international conflict. Rather, it seemed like an internal settlement between gangs. And the person who revealed Screamin' and Richie's whereabouts must be someone who knew them intimately. Since the warehouse money laundering spot had been compromised, the next transaction would surely have to move elsewhere. The next step is simply to monitor the two brothers' schedule, which will likely yield more clues. Simultaneously, Screamin' called Richie to report what their adoptive mother had just said. He then anxiously and quickly expressed that her tone was very strange, urging both of them to sort out their belongings and absolutely not implicate her. It seemed she no longer wanted to cover for them. However, Richie was unconcerned, even confidently stating that Susan would never betray them. However, compared to Richie's optimism, Screamin' constantly felt uneasy. Therefore, he declared that after completing this job, he would retire from crime. Seeing his brother was too scared, Richie reluctantly compromised. That evening, the two brothers went to Screamin's house. Richie wanted to quickly complete the next deal before things escalated, as this job concerned the future lives of 300 orphans in the city. It turned out that the brothers engaged in these illegal activities not for themselves, but for those defenseless orphans. As the saying goes, because I once stood in the rain, I want to hold an umbrella for others. Thinking of those poor children, Screamin', who initially had a rigid attitude, softened and agreed with Richie to act quickly. However, before they could deploy their plan, Lisa found Screamin' a step ahead. She astutely noticed that he seemed less extreme than Richie, thinking she might be able to extract more information from him. Nevertheless, although Screamin' intended to retire, he never considered betraying his brother. Their conversation only went in circles, revealing not a single clue. But Lisa did not give up easily. Afterward, she brought her subordinate and repeatedly showed up at the brothers' meetings, continuously monitoring their every move. This surveillance made Richie extremely uncomfortable. On his way home that evening, he finally couldn't hold back, erupting in rage and questioning Screamin' about his involvement with the female detective. The continuous pressure and panic over several days completely snapped the tension in both their minds. The verbal argument eventually turned into a physical fight. After an unknown length of time, the two finally stopped. After calming down for a moment, they eventually shook hands and made peace. After all, they had relied on each other for so many years. They couldn't turn into enemies because of one female detective. However, before leaving, Richie seriously reminded him, "This transaction must proceed as planned. Screamin' absolutely must not make a mistake at the crucial moment." Concurrently, the robbery case became the state's front-page headline in the media. Lisa and her team were forced to accelerate the investigation, simultaneously deploying more personnel for close surveillance on the streets, leaving no action of Screamin' and his associates unchecked. They committed to the public, who were closely following the case, that they would strive to completely dismantle this criminal organization that had been entrenched in the city for many years in the shortest possible time. After grasping the police's deployment, Screamin' and Richie also felt a strong sense of impending crisis. Therefore, before the operation began, the two brothers spent the whole day immersed in the training ground, tirelessly practicing shooting and physical conditioning. However, time quickly advanced to 24 hours before the transaction. At this point, most of the state's police force had been mobilized, ready for Lisa's command. And Screamin' and his crew had also arrived at the base to discuss the next action plan. This time, they decided to rob a federal government money transport helicopter. It turned out that every year, the Federal Reserve Bank creates millions of new bills to issue to businesses to stimulate domestic consumption. However, this massive amount of cash would rather be given to the rich than put into the hands of the poor. This made Screamin' and his crew particularly dissatisfied, so they planned this cash heist. Because this time they had to confront federal government personnel directly, Richie Wutz was extremely cautious when assigning tasks. They had previously investigated that the escort personnel would use ghost vehicles as a distraction. The convoy with extra security guards would be the decoy, while the real convoy would take the cash to the helicopter pad. However, all personnel responsible for the escort were fully armed, making an interception on the road almost impossible. Therefore, after careful consideration, the transport helicopter was the best point of breakthrough. They quickly analyzed the personnel deployment and surrounding environmental factors, unanimously agreeing that the co-pilot's seat was the biggest weakness, as that position was often filled by a newcomer. And their mission was to control the flight crew as much as possible and ensure no one hit the emergency distress button in the cockpit before they acted. If the red alarm sounded, rescue forces would be on the scene within 4 minutes. After all scenarios were clarified, Screamin' as usual asked if anyone wanted to withdraw at this moment. The answer he received was prolonged silence. After a night's rest, the team drove to the helicopter pad. And at this time, the escort vehicle was also on the road, expected to arrive at the delivery point in 25 minutes. At the same time, the pilot was performing a pre-flight check. The co-pilot stepped out of the aircraft to check the situation. Unexpectedly, a strange man hastily walked onto the helicopter pad. Seeing this, the co-pilot, without thinking quickly, signaled for the man to leave. However, the man loudly shouted that he was Pete, and he was here because the helicopter had a problem and needed maintenance. The co-pilot, who knew no Pete, quickly turned to ask the captain. The captain was also puzzled, but saw signs of an oil leak in the gearbox, forcing him to shut down the aircraft's engine for further inspection. Not long after Screamin' and his team received the news sent by their associate. After learning that the helicopter issue had been addressed, a weight was lifted off their minds. Elsewhere, the man disguised as a maintenance worker was still engaged in a fierce battle of wits, with the two pilots insisting that the helicopter was not yet cleared for takeoff. Unexpectedly, the captain was not easily fooled and immediately demanded that he present the relevant documents. Hearing this, the man immediately changed tactics, retreating to advance, saying he was only responsible for notification. If the captain insisted on flying, he wouldn't stop him, since the control was in the other party's hands anyway. However, the two pilots couldn't help but whisper among themselves because no matter how important the mission was, it wasn't worth their lives. So the captain signaled the money truck, which had already entered the tarmac, to wait a moment and unload the cargo after the helicopter was maintained. They had no idea that at this moment, the robbers were speeding toward them. At the same time, two accomplices had infiltrated the nearby surveillance system, accurately locating the police's current position. Fortunately, they were not too close to the police's location, so they still had plenty of time. Thus, Screamin' and his crew prepared to proceed with the next step. The man disguised as a repairman pretended to inspect the helicopter for a while, finally made up an excuse, and left. Coincidentally, Pete, the real maintenance worker, appeared just in time, helping him divert attention slightly. But the police officer responsible for the escort noticed something unusual. His eyes were fixed on the man about to leave, and he saw the man walk straight to the white truck outside the helicopter pad. Immediately after, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a terrifying sight. Because the incident happened too suddenly, most of the police didn't have time to react and became victims of the robber's gunfire. However, during the chaotic fight, the robber disguised as a repairman was also unfortunately shot and fell. This sight encouraged the police, and a heavy barrage of bullets poured down again. Seeing the scene in absolute chaos, the captain quickly scrambled up and rushed towards the helicopter, but was spotted and timely stopped by Richie. Others also rushed over to help. The scene immediately became a standoff. Realizing the captain was trying to press the emergency distress button, Richie ruthlessly threatened the lives of the pilot's wife and children, demanding he put his hands down. Hearing these words, the captain could only reluctantly step out of the cockpit and obediently lie flat on the ground. The robbers then left one person to control the surviving police officer on the tarmac, while the others prepared to load the money onto the truck. But just then, the accomplice responsible for external surveillance warned them again that another police unit was only 8 kilometers away. Therefore, although they still had time, they should finish quickly. While the robbers were frantically loading the cash, the Texas State Police Department was in complete uproar. Lisa aggressively led her team toward the crime scene, but was clearly too late. Therefore, she could only order the lockdown of all bridges and exits in the city, contacting nearby patrol teams to intercept every white truck at all costs. Elsewhere, Screamin' and his crew also received an urgent notification saying that rescue forces were heading towards the helicopter pad. Everyone was pale with fright. The captain was under their control, so who managed to avoid them and alert the authorities? Everyone's gaze shifted back to the helicopter. They realized it was the co-pilot who had quietly crawled back into the cockpit when they weren't paying attention and pressed the emergency distress button. Richie immediately prepared to silence him, but was stopped in time by Screamin'. Finally, under Screamin's threat, the co-pilot slowly took his hand off the button and was lucky enough to save his own life. After confirming he had no hidden weapons, everyone felt relieved and quickly retreated. And the wounded robber was abandoned by them on the spot. When Lisa led her team there, all that remained were scattered bodies and the 2 pilots who were still in shock. At the same time, Dean had led the gray-haired boss to another base preparing to set a trap and reenact the old hands bully the newcomers scene. Unexpectedly, Screamin' and his crew's car stopped in the city center. They transferred all the stolen money to a new vehicle, preparing to change their clothes and continue on their way. They were completely unaware that their every move had been captured by the drone overhead, and Lisa hated them so much her teeth ground, swearing she would absolutely bring those people to justice. Not long after news of this exceptionally large robbery broke, Susan watched silently, a complex, unreadable expression on her face. Elsewhere, Dean and the gray-haired boss were still anxiously waiting. Just as their patience was about to run out, the familiar car finally appeared. Dean was immediately ecstatic, preparing to get out of the car with the others to intercept them, but was stopped by a sharp shout from the boss. Clearly, the boss still didn't fully trust him. Not long after, heavy gunfire erupted from the warehouse. But the situation was beyond Dean's prediction. It turned out that Screamin' and his crew had long noticed the anomaly, so they had left an accomplice in ambush ready to surprise them. Seeing that the situation was bad, Dean hastily opened the car door and escaped. And those outside the warehouse, seeing they couldn't take down the target after continuous attack, also chose to retreat following the boss's signal. The 2 robbers rushed out, but the opponents had vanished. At the same time, Screamin' and Richie had left the warehouse through the back door and headed straight to their adoptive mother Susan's house, preparing to hide the stolen money there first. Seeing this, Susan immediately jumped up in anger, not wanting the 2 of them to drag her into this matter. But the 2 brothers ignored her and continued to move the money on their own. Just as the 2 sides were about to engage in a fierce argument, Police Chief Kip suddenly walked in. Richie immediately drew his gun, intently watching this uninvited man. Seeing this, Kip was not afraid, instead, cooperating by raising both hands to signal he would do nothing. Unexpectedly, they were family. It turned out that Kip was also a child adopted by Susan. He had always worked in LaGuardia. He coincidentally learned 2 weeks ago that the federal police department was preparing to investigate his brothers. So he proactively requested a transfer to the state of Texas, only then getting the chance to help Screamin' and his crew cover up everything. Afterward, they didn't have time to explain the details to Susan and quickly drove off to find Dean, the one who had betrayed them. Not long after, they found Dean anxiously pacing in a warehouse in the suburbs. The moment he saw Screamin' and Richie Dean like a mouse seeing a cat, bolted and ran. The 2 men immediately chased after him. But driven by the will to survive, Dean burst out with extraordinary speed, leaving the 2 men unable to catch up despite their best efforts. Fortunately, Kip drove to the scene just in time via a shortcut, blocking Dean, who still intended to escape. Seeing that the 3 had blocked all exits, Dean resignedly stopped. Screamin', seeing this, immediately landed an angry punch on him. Then Richie also rushed forward, and the 2 brothers cooperated in a chaotic fight. If Kip hadn't intervened, Dean might have been beaten to death. Waiting until Dean struggled to his feet, Kip finally exploded, holding a gun to the other's head and demanding to know who he was cooperating with. Dean initially wanted to continue denying it, but under the threat of the gun barrel, he reluctantly confessed that his associate was Russian. Hearing this, the 3 others felt even more furious, unable to believe their brother had betrayed them. Unexpectedly, Dean was even more agitated than them. He loudly questioned why they had abandoned him. If it weren't for the vast distance between everyone, he wouldn't have chosen to do this out of jealousy and resentment. As if a switch had been flipped, Dean furiously poured out all the grievances in his heart. And the mood of the three brothers, Screamin', also became incredibly complex. They realized their own excessive actions, but didn't know how to offer comfort. However, an incident suddenly occurred. Two Russian mafia members appeared and shot at them. Seeing the mission completed, the two Russian mafiosos immediately turned their backs and left with no intention of engaging the other three. Screamin' then rushed over to Dean, but by this time he had completely stopped breathing. The three were instantly overwhelmed with grief. But before they could escape their sorrow, Dean's phone suddenly rang. The caller was none other than the Russian mafia boss. It turned out the boss had broken into the house and taken control of Susan. Screamin's heart immediately leaped into his throat. But the gray-haired boss said he only wanted the money. As soon as he received the funds, he would quickly withdraw his men. With that, he hung up. And the three brothers looked at each other, finally reaching a silent agreement. So after tending to Dean's body, they fully armed themselves, preparing to respond to the rendezvous. The movie also closes with the resolute eyes of the three men. As for the final outcome, it seems only the sequel can reveal it. In summary, the core plot is that children who grew up in the lower social class chose to band together to rob the rich and help the poor, shielding those with similarly tragic fates, using the stolen money to help those who needed it more. Although the story's ending is slightly rushed and open-ended, the overall completion is commendable, and the viewing experience is very good. A movie's value lies in its reputation, and the value of a movie review lies in its feeling. Today's story ends here. Thank you for watching. What did you think of the movie? Please comment below.